Ready? All right.
2 seconds.
Okay.
Make sure that it's live. We're good.
Good afternoon. My name's Ivan Bates. I'm running for State's Attorney in Baltimore City. And I want to bring to you some of the problems that we're having in our city. This involves the case of Matthew Caldwell, 17-year-old who was recently tried for murder, first degree, and found not guilty. It's an epic failure of the mismanagement of the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office under the current State's Attorney. On May 5th, 2020, there was videotape that showed a murder of Mr. Spangler. It was around 6 o'clock in the morning, 300 block of South Monroe Street. There's an altercation, an incident. You see a gentleman who the video says, or it looks like Matthew Caldwell, and another individual. They get in an argument with this 51-year-old male. They pistol whip him, they stomp him, they beat him. It's a vicious, violent attack. They take the victim outside, they drag him on the ground, they take him in the back, they put a gun to his head and they shoot him. When they shoot him, they leave evidence of the crime. And the evidence of the crime is a shell casing to that gun that committed that murder. That's on May 5th. On May 12th, 2020, there's an attempt robbery and a shooting at Royals Farm, right there, I believe, 3600 block Kinsworth Avenue. The victim, the clerk, is shot. It's attempt robbery. The police, Detective Vini, does a good job, Baltimore City Police Department, homicide detective, 20 years experience. He puts together the case and he identifies a suspect, Matthew Caldwell. He puts out an arrest warrant, and on August 11th, 2020, Mr. Caldwell is arrested. He's arrested with a handgun. The tests are produced on that handgun, and it shows that the bullets, the ballistic evidence, that shell casing was underneath the victim, it matches the handgun that was found on Mr. Caldwell when he's arrested. That's when the first State's Attorney, Patrick Seidel, an experienced prosecutor, he indicts the case in October of 2020. However, he then leaves the State's Attorney's office. The next prosecutor, Mr. Tyler Morrison, he has the murder case. He keeps it for a while. This prosecutor leaves the State's Attorney's office. And now it falls on the desk of Megan Gallo, a brand new, inexperienced homicide prosecutor. The case is set for trial April 18th, 2022. The defense attorney filed a motion, and this motion says there's evidence that we need that the State's Attorney's Office hasn't given us. This evidence is what's called a motion to compel, and the only thing that the defense attorney wants is the standard operating procedures. It's a manual of the Baltimore City Crime Department. What do they do in analyzing their evidence? It's a manual, and it's also in the State's Attorney's purview to have. That manual isn't given. There's a hearing on April 12th, 2022, and a circuit court judge orders the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office to turn over that manual. It's not done. It's go to trial on April 18th, 2022. The trial happens, and the first thing the defense asks is, say, Your Honor, because they did not give us this manual, as the court said, we're asking this case dismiss it. Dismiss and suppress the evidence involving the shell casing. Remember, the shell casing links to the murder weapon. The judge must grant that motion, and therefore the murder weapon doesn't come in. The only evidence left now is the videotape. And this inexperienced prosecutor did not realize the only way they could introduce the videotape of this murder is to have someone authenticate the tape. Because they didn't know that, because they weren't trained properly, they don't do that. There is no evidence to convict Matthew Caldwell of this murder. This mismanagement is unacceptable. In my prosecution plan, I talk about vertical prosecution, the only way to handle that. I talk about bringing back prosecutors to this office because they want to work with me and only me. We have to stop this history that we can see of mismanagement. If we just look at the facts, under Patricia Jessamine, we had a murder rate in 2007 of 282. Then it dropped under Greg Bernstein to 197. And now, under Marilyn Mosby, in 2015, it's been 300 murders every single year. It's a history of mismanagement that if we don't do something about it, it's only going to get worse. And that is why I'm here to bring that to your attention. What we've done with our campaign, we didn't just look at this case, we looked at so many other cases and more in depth information from the state's attorney's office. And we have that information, we'll be giving it out in the near future, so that you can really see what's been going on. This information is so in depth and so detailed that you have a right to know what's been going on, to understand the mismanagement and the reason our city has been unsafe. And so we have to change the narrative. We have to let you understand what's happening, because Ivan Bates is the only person you should be thinking about for state's attorney.
Any
questions?
So we'll just start over, here with Alex and go down.
As far as what happened at trial and, how these different motions were heard and everything like that, I mean, did you sit in on the case? How do you know that, and how can we verify what happened?
Well, you always have the videotapes. You can always look at the videotapes. We did have people who we know sat in, we've spoken to them, so we're very comfortable with the information based on the numerous sources that we've looked at, that we've spoken to, and that we've been able to view ourselves.
Your plans that talked about brain drain in the prosecutor's office, how can you make it a more appealing job to be in?
Well, the big thing is prosecutors want to be with a person who's going to be committed to that position. I'm the only person who's committed to 8 to 10 years. It's going to take 8 to 10 years to fix the problems in the state's attorney's office. This isn't a stepping stone for me. Prosecutors and former prosecutors have reached out to me and said, I want to work with you. Retired judges and additional judges on the bench have said, if you get in that office and when you get in that office, I will retire to work with you. I have the ability, having my own law practice and doing it from scratch all the way to where we are now, one of the top criminal defense attorneys in the state, I understand what we need to do to train young prosecutors and to work with older prosecutors. Experience. In my prosecution plan, I talk about the working together. I talk about establishing that pipeline from young prosecutors to older prosecutors with that experience to make sure that we can keep the citizens safe.
Do you think that caseload, I feel like I've seen Ms. Gallo in trial a number of times, probably leading right up to this case. Do you think caseload has anything to do with this, and how would you address that?
Without a doubt, caseload does, and my prosecution plan talks about that. I talk about making sure we recruit the brightest young law clerks from the University of Baltimore as well as the University of Maryland. And that's what I've done in my practice, so I understand this works. Having them do the build-up, having them do the case preparation, but also having experienced prosecutors sit next to young, inexperienced prosecutors, knowing that they've done the right things, knowing that we know how to look over the cases. Look, I prosecuted almost 500 prosecution cases, and I've done thousands of defense cases, whether the federal or the state. I have more experience than anybody that's considering being state's attorney. I understand what to do, and I know how to make teams work effectively so that we can get the job done.
Question about your time as a prosecutor. How many homicide cases did you take to trial?
Did I take to trial? I think I took about 2 or 3 to trial as a homicide prosecutor. As a defense attorney, I've probably done 10, 15 to trial as a defense attorney. Matter of fact, I'm doing a triple homicide right now in Los Angeles. So my skill set is asked for nationally to do cases. It is that experience that leads me and everybody to say I'm the most experienced person for this job.
Do you have any follow-up on that?
And also, when you ask about that, when I was a young prosecutor, homicide prosecutor, I had an older, more experienced prosecutor sitting next to me. And that prosecutor and I were able to get the conviction on Wesley Whiting, who's still doing a life sentence. If you want, I have the transcripts for you to read.
And so you had second chairs then?
I had second chairs, and that's how I know it works. In Baltimore County, you have second chairs. Other jurisdictions have second chairs. One of the problems that we have in the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office is that the people who make the most money are not doing the job. As the state's attorney for Baltimore City, I will prosecute a minimum of 1 homicide a year. You're very busy, but you must make sure that you're leading by example.
Are there situations when by a prosecutor, that it doesn't go to trial and results in a plea?
Yes, when you've really prepared your case, and that's why discovery is important. Here, what the defense, let's think about what the defense was asking. The defense attorney was only asking for a manual. If that manual would have been given to the defense attorney, this case more than likely could have resulted in a plea. Because the defense attorney would have said they had the ballistics evidence, the shell casing is under the victim, the handgun is on you, and you look like the individual in the videotape. That's what the officers and the witnesses would say. That could have been a plea, but because it was not properly prepared, and because the prosecutor did not have the experience and the mismanagement of the office, you have a not guilty on a person that, based on what we can see with the evidence, was a very vicious, violent murder.
As far as second chair, and you talked about how when you were a young homicide prosecutor, you always had a second chair.
Not always, but in that particular case.
Sure. Is that something that you're kind of committed to bringing back? And if so, how do you do it? I mean, with the number of homicide cases that there are, I mean, how do you find enough people to have two prosecutors sit in on every, on a lot of cases?
And can you describe second chair as well for some of who are unfamiliar?
So yes, a second chair is when you have a person who is experienced, the senior prosecutor, and then you have a junior prosecutor, and I talk about that in my plan. That's very simple. The people in the state's attorney's office with the experience aren't prosecuting the cases. If everybody was sharing on the workload, then you would not have as many prosecutors being overwhelmed. A young prosecutor, say they're in the misdemeanor division, they will do anything to sit next to an experienced prosecutor handling a murder, a homicide. That's where the people are there, but they're not being used effectively. That is the mismanagement of the office. Look, as a private defense attorney, I have a huge caseload. And I know what works with my caseload. I know how I was able to take my young associate, have them sit with me time after time. Even the law clerks sitting there in the courtroom watching the homicide. That's when those law clerks, because of my prosecution plan, I talk about having a pathway from being a young law student and knowing you want to be a prosecutor to saying when you're a law clerk, we'll work with you, we'll teach you, and we're the type of individual who now will become a prosecutor. There are many people in the state who are not in the state's attorney's office, but are in law schools around our city that want to be prosecutors. We have a pathway to make that happen. I'm the only one talking about what we need to do to fix the state's attorney's office. And some people have called it the brain drain.
And to give it a little context on that, can you also just briefly recap the turnover number that we've seen?
Well, one of the things that you see in the state's attorney's office in reference to the turnovers, we calculate there have been about 234, 235 new prosecutors since 2015. That is an absurd number. But there are only about 153 to 163 positions that are actually really prosecuting cases. When you talk about from day one what happened in the state's attorney's office is absolutely astounding. What we have to do is really change that narrative. And once again, I'm the only person that these prosecutors have reached out to and said, I want to work with you. Prosecutors from around the country. One of the things that you're able to do, having done cases in the federal case throughout Virginia, all around the state of Maryland, cases in Pennsylvania, argued appeals down there in Louisiana, federal cases in California, and state cases in California, I know attorneys around the country. I've seen the best and the brightest. I know what works in other jurisdictions. I know what will work in Baltimore City. These individuals want to work with me. Why? Because they want to be part of the narrative. They want to be a part of the change. It's not just me, it's us. It's all of us being a part of the change. Because when you have a great leader, people easily want to follow. And that's why they want to be with me.
Were there any other questions before we call?
Thank you very much for coming. And have a beautiful, safe day. So next week, there's some additional data and information that'll be very good for you to have because it's something that nobody else realizes that we now have obtained.
The context is that today we were covering one case. We have some office-wide data that is kind of being finalized right now that we plan to release next week.
Thank you very much.